He was called the Golden-Mouthed, a preacher so eloquent that emperors trembled at his sermons. But eloquence alone could not save him forever from exile, not once, but twice. His words shook the empire, and one night, the greatest cathedral in Constantinople burned. From his own pulpit, he challenged the most powerful woman in the Eastern Roman Empire. She answered with intrigue, soldiers, and exile, determined to silence the bishop who defied her. Frail and dying, he was dragged through freezing rain toward the edge of the known world. He died far from home, but 31 years later, Constantinople begged for his return. How did one preacher become so dangerous that an empire feared every word he spoke? Above all other things, John was a monk. Yet before wearing a hermit's rough garment, he had lived a very different life. He was a lawyer trained by one of the greatest pagan orators in the entire Greek-speaking world of late antiquity. His teacher was Libanius, a celebrated rhetorician whose command of language had become legendary throughout the Eastern Roman provinces and especially Antioch. Before his assembled pupils, someone once asked the aging Libanius which student should succeed him as the greatest orator of the coming age. With visible disappointment, Libanius reportedly answered, "John, but the Christians have laid claim on him." John's mother, Anthusa, possessed a fierce and deeply personal Christian devotion that shaped every part of her widowed life in Antioch. Widowed while still young, she poured her hopes, ambitions, and very identity into raising her only son. She rejoiced when her 20-year-old son, already a successful lawyer, asked to join those preparing to receive Christian baptism. 3 years later, after completing the required instruction, John was baptized by Bishop Meletius of Antioch. His mother rejoiced again, believing her son's future in the church and in respectable society was now secure among Antioch's honored citizens. Her joy quickly became horror when John revealed before his astonished family that he intended to leave Antioch and withdraw into the wilderness. He wanted to abandon city life completely and live as a monk among the ascetics beyond Antioch. Anthusa begged him, "Do not make me a widow a second time. Wait, at least, until I am dead." She pleaded through tears. She continued, "Then go wherever you wish, but while I live, endure to remain here with me." John immediately made his mother a solemn promise. He would never leave her side for as long as she remained alive. These early tensions between family duty and divine calling may later have echoed through his sermons about marriage and household life. John understood the struggles of family obligation from direct experience, not merely from theory or abstract theological reflection within his own household. His solution to the impasse was elegant, though certainly unconventional. Instead of leaving his mother's house, he transformed it, without abandoning his promise. The comfortable family home became, in effect, a small monastery governed by prayer, discipline, study, and simplicity. Every day, John lived beside 3 like-minded friends, studying scripture, praying at fixed hours, and eating the simplest available food. Through all this disciplined practice, he technically remained beneath his mother's roof, and faithfully kept the promise he had made to Anthusa. Only after Anthusa died did John finally leave Antioch and join monks in the harsh, rocky mountains lying beyond the city. He spent 4 years learning the disciplines, demands, and shared responsibilities of life within a monastic community. Then, day and night, he spent 2 more years in harsher solitude, living alone inside a cave and speaking to almost nobody. Later, John openly admitted that such extreme isolation had not provided the best possible preparation for the pastoral work awaiting a future bishop. He warned that monks entering active ministry often found themselves completely unable to face the difficulties of priesthood or episcopal leadership. After 6 years of monastic withdrawal, John finally returned to Antioch, where the city church first ordained him to serve as a deacon. Shortly afterward, he became a presbyter, or priest. In that new role, he began the preaching that would make him famous. Within only a few years of John entering the pulpit, his reputation spread with startling speed throughout Antioch and far beyond it. Stories of his eloquence, biblical insight, and fearless moral clarity echoed throughout the entire Greek-speaking Christian world and neighboring provinces. In 397, an unexpected opportunity arose. The bishopric of Constantinople, the imperial capital called New Rome, became vacant after its previous bishop died. The emperor's advisors decided that Antioch's celebrated preacher was exactly the man needed to fill this powerful position without any further delay. There was only one problem. John's popularity had become so intense that officials feared announcing his departure before the people of Antioch. They believed the people who adored him might riot rather than allow their beloved preacher to leave the city without determined resistance. The imperial authorities therefore used deception. Under an official pretext, they secretly invited John to visit a small chapel beyond Antioch's walls. When he arrived, waiting soldiers pushed him into a guarded carriage before he could understand what was happening. In early 398, John was consecrated Bishop of Constantinople, receiving enormous prestige and, as he soon discovered at court, enormous danger. Constantinople was, by every measure, a wealthy city devoted to luxury, ambition, display, and constant political intrigue. The great Emperor Theodosius, who had united the empire beneath Christian orthodoxy, was now dead. His two sons succeeded him. Honorius ruled in the west, while Arcadius occupied the eastern imperial throne. Contemporary observers and later historians alike describe both brothers as indolent, ineffective, and poorly equipped for the responsibilities of imperial government. Arcadius supposedly ruled the east from Constantinople. In reality, he was controlled almost completely by the chamberlain Eutropius. Eutropius was a former slave who had risen through cunning and ruthlessness to become the true power behind the throne in Constantinople. He used his influence to satisfy his own limitless ambition and the greed of an extensive network of clients and cronies. Empress Eudoxia felt humiliated by the chamberlain's hold over power, although Eutropius had arranged her marriage to Arcadius. The irony of her resentment would have been obvious to anyone observing the imperial court with careful attention. Even John's appointment had become entangled within this web of rivalry, patronage, resentment, and ecclesiastical ambition. Theophilus, the powerful patriarch of Alexandria, had campaigned to secure Constantinople's bishopric for one of his own Alexandrian allies during the vacancy. John received the position only through Eutropius's personal intervention, a political fact that would later return repeatedly to haunt his episcopate. The new bishop understood only dimly how deep the political currents surrounding his appointment and ministry truly ran. Even with complete knowledge of the intrigue, everything known about John's character suggests that he would have behaved in precisely the same way. The former monk remained a monk at heart, regardless of the wealth, privilege, and expectations attached to his new office in Constantinople. He could not tolerate wealthy Christians attempting to combine Christ's gospel with comfortable lives defined by luxury and status within the imperial capital. John's first task as bishop was reforming the clergy under his authority, and what he discovered troubled him deeply from the beginning. Some priests publicly claimed celibacy, while privately keeping women in their homes, who were euphemistically called spiritual sisters. This arrangement scandalized devout Christians and provided endless ammunition throughout the pagan world to relentless critics attacking the church's moral credibility. Other clergymen had enriched themselves through office and lived almost as luxuriously as aristocrats and powerful members of the imperial court. Meanwhile, the church's finances were in complete disorder, with records neglected and money handled without meaningful accountability. Pastoral care for ordinary believers had also suffered, especially among widows, orphans, sick people, and the poor. Court politics and personal enrichment had displaced the church's daily responsibility toward people who were most vulnerable and most easily forgotten. John acted decisively against every abuse. He ordered the so-called spiritual sisters removed from the homes of clergymen without delay. He demanded the priests embrace austere and disciplined lives appropriate to the sacred calling they publicly claimed. Church finances were reorganized beneath a new and rigorous system of scrutiny, documentation, responsibility, and accountability. Inside Constantinople, luxury objects traditionally displayed in the bishop's residence were removed and sold instead of remaining symbols of ecclesiastical status. Throughout Constantinople, the proceeds were redirected every day toward feeding hungry people and sheltering those who had nowhere safe to sleep. Across the city, John ordered churches opened at hours serving ordinary laborers, not merely at times convenient for the leisured wealthy. Each week, workers dependent upon daily wages could attend worship without abandoning the labor required to provide food for their families. These measures naturally earned John fervent admirers and bitter enemies in almost exactly equal numbers. Reformation, however, could not remain confined to clergy. The laity also needed to hear the gospel's uncomfortable demands. From Hagia Sophia's pulpit, the golden-mouthed preacher thundered against luxury, exploitation, and the indifference of wealthy Christians. He declared that golden ornaments on horses, slaves, and shoes revealed people robbing orphans and starving widows. Throughout the city, he warned that every magnificent mansion testified about tears, stolen inheritances, wronged widows, and workers deprived of honest wages. Even death, John insisted, would not deliver the wealthy from the accusations created by lives built upon injustice. Constantinople's powerful elite could not tolerate forever the voice challenging them so directly from the empire's greatest church. Eutropius, who had engineered John's appointment, expected gratitude, special treatment, and political favors in return for his patronage. That exchange of favors represented the ordinary operation of power inside Constantinople's imperial and ecclesiastical institutions. John understood power differently. In plain language, he treated Eutropius as another soul that needed to hear the gospel without flattery. The result became bitterly ironic. Eutropius regretted not his sins, but his decision to bring John into Constantinople in the first place. At the imperial court, Eutropius had introduced an uncompromising preacher who refused to respect the habits by which powerful men protected themselves. The decisive conflict erupted over a matter of enormous seriousness: the Church's ancient and sacred right of sanctuary. During the crisis, several political enemies of Eutropius fled into Hagia Sophia, trusting the protection traditionally granted on ancient sacred ground. Eutropius simply sent soldiers after them, intending to drag the fugitives from the cathedral by force. John remained entirely unbending. Under no circumstances would he allow the soldiers standing before him to enter and violate the sanctuary. Eutropius protested furiously before Arcadius, but for once, the weak emperor did not submit to his powerful favorite. After this confrontation, Eutropius's influence visibly declined, and public opinion among contemporaries connected his fall directly with the clash against John. At last, a sudden series of political events completed his downfall, bringing enormous joy to people long exploited beneath his rule. Angry crowds formed throughout Constantinople and demanded vengeance against the chamberlain who had oppressed them for years. In desperation, Eutropius chose the refuge once used by his enemies. He ran into Hagia Sophia and embraced the great altar. When the mob reached the altar to seize him, John stood in their path and invoked the same ancient right of sanctuary. Inside the cathedral, John astonishingly defended his former enemy against the people, the army, and the emperor's uncertain will that day. He refused to abandon principle because the person seeking protection had been ruthless, corrupt, openly hostile, and personally dangerous during earlier years. Eutropius, however, distrusted the Church's weak defenses and eventually fled from the refuge that John had protected. He was captured shortly afterward and executed without mercy by representatives of the world he had manipulated during his years of power. The episode proved that John's moral principles still applied in the hour of danger, even while defending an adversary almost everyone else despised. By confronting one powerful enemy, John inevitably created many others among the court and Constantinople's wealthy elite. The most dangerous of these enemies was now Empress Eudoxia, whose resentment combined political rivalry with personal offense. She deeply resented the bishop's growing authority and the moral influence he exercised over Constantinople's ordinary population. John's sermons against pomp, vanity, and the foolishness of powerful people also described the empress with uncomfortable accuracy. Whenever he preached against such excesses, Eudoxia felt the eyes of the entire congregation turning directly toward her. Before his influence grew stronger, Eudoxia believed she needed to discover some method of silencing this increasingly troublesome voice from the pulpit. At first, the empress used highly calculated generosity, presenting the church with special grants and magnificent gifts during elaborate public ceremonies. She apparently hoped that public generosity might purchase goodwill, moderation, or at least silence from the bishop whose preaching offended her. John politely thanked Eudoxia for her generosity. Then he continued preaching exactly as before, without modifying his message. During John's absence on church business in Ephesus, the frustrated empress finally turned from unsuccessful gifts toward far more direct methods. Eudoxia joined forces with the powerful Theophilus of Alexandria, who for years had never forgiven John for receiving the bishopric of Constantinople. Together at court, they began planning the downfall of a preacher who had become both a religious challenge and a political danger. When John returned, he faced an extensive list of accusations that were frequently petty, contradictory, or simply absurd. The charges had been assembled before a small gathering of bishops convened by Theophilus specifically to condemn him. John largely ignored the proceedings and continued his ordinary work of preaching, visiting the sick, and directing pastoral care as if nothing had happened. Theophilus condemned him in absentia, and Arcadius, relentlessly pressured by Eudoxia, ordered John to leave Constantinople immediately. The situation in Constantinople immediately became tense. In the people's eyes, the sentence against John represented a grave and obvious injustice. Bishops and clergy from surrounding towns poured into the capital and publicly promised support for the beleaguered bishop. The moment contained enormous potential for confrontation. John needed only to speak, and resistance could have spread rapidly. A counter-synod might easily have condemned Theophilus and every bishop who had participated in the hostile proceedings. Combined with a popular uprising already close to eruption, such action might have shaken imperial authority across the entire Eastern Empire. One command from the eloquent and beloved bishop could perhaps have reduced the entire conspiracy against him to dust almost overnight. Arcadius and Eudoxia understood the danger perfectly and prepared defensive measures around the palace for possible open conflict. Chrysostom, however, was above all a lover of peace who refused to pursue victory through bloodshed and chaos. Rather than encourage resistance, he accepted exile and chose to make peace with the sentence imposed against him. 3 days after receiving the decree, John quietly said farewell to his closest friends and surrendered to the authorities without public resistance. The population did not accept matters so peacefully. Even without John's encouragement, the streets erupted into serious unrest. Rumors of open rebellion against the throne spread quickly through every quarter of the imperial capital. During those days, the emperor, empress, and even the army scarcely dared to appear outside the protection of the palace walls. Before dawn, a powerful earthquake shook Constantinople, and many people interpreted it as an unmistakable sign of divine displeasure that morning. Deeply terrified by the earthquake and unrest, Eudoxia sent urgent messages pleading that John should be recalled from his brief exile. John returned to his pulpit amid thunderous acclamation from crowds throughout Constantinople that had recently rioted on his behalf that day. The underlying causes of conflict had never been resolved. Fear and political necessity had only suppressed them for a short time. After several months of renewed intrigue and mounting humiliation, John received a second and more determined order of exile from the imperial court. Once again, his closest friends urged him to resist, summon his supporters, and fight through every available means. Once again, John refused their counsel and quietly submitted rather than provoke further violence against people he loved. This time, however, peaceful surrender would not prevent the very disaster he had desperately hoped to avoid. Despite John's submission, riots erupted. Desperate crowds gathered at Hagia Sophia in a chaotic protest against his removal. The army received orders to disperse the gathering by force, bringing soldiers and protesters into a violent confrontation. Before watching crowds, fire broke out during the struggle and spread with terrifying speed through the wooden structures surrounding the cathedral. Hagia Sophia itself and several important public buildings were severely damaged or completely destroyed by the expanding blaze. To this day, historians have never definitively established the true cause of that devastating and politically consequential fire. During the investigation, many devoted supporters of Chrysostom were brutally tortured as officials searched for information and confessions. His closest and best-known friends were arrested and banished far from court, where they could no longer influence political or religious events. John himself was led into permanent exile at Caucasus, an obscure village deep within the mountains of Armenia Minor, under armed guard. From distant exile and without a pulpit, the golden-mouthed preacher took up his pen and continued ministering through an enormous correspondence. Hundreds of letters carried his eloquence and unbroken spirit to friends, supporters, and church leaders throughout the empire. Without hesitation, Innocent, the Bishop of Rome, embraced John's cause with genuine passion and sent protests to authorities throughout the empire. Many other Western church leaders followed his example and condemned the government's harsh treatment of the beloved bishop. Criticism came from almost every part of the Christian world, while Theophilus found remarkably little support among most influential Eastern bishops. Only a handful of timid bishops remained beside him, too frightened of imperial displeasure to voice honest opposition. As controversy intensified, remote Caucasus unexpectedly became a center of attention for Christians across the Roman world. Pilgrims, messengers, letters, supplies, and news arrived in the obscure mountain village from distant corners of the empire. Then Empress Eudoxia died unexpectedly. Many hoped her death might persuade Arcadius to reverse his policy toward John. The emperor did not change course. Bishops seeking imperial favor continued supporting John's banishment even after Eudoxia's death. In the West, Pope Innocent remained convinced that authorities had committed a grave injustice against the exiled bishop. He appealed directly to Arcadius's Western counterpart and brother, the Emperor Honorius, asking him to intervene. Honorius responded by sending a delegation from the Latin West with an official letter demanding a fair and impartial synod at Salonika. The proposed council would meet at Salonika and carefully review every charge that had been presented against John. Instead, Eastern officials gave the delegation what observers called Babylonian treatment, seizing and harshly interrogating them without any legal protection whatsoever. Officials even offered the delegates approximately 3,000 Roman gold pieces, hoping to purchase their silence and cooperation before imperial authorities. Under armed supervision, the delegates were eventually sent westward in a small, barely seaworthy vessel that nearly sank during the journey. Meanwhile, John's remaining influential supporters disappeared into remote fortresses, secretly exiled where they could threaten nobody in power. In the government's judgment, even remote Chrysostom remained too close and accessible to serve as a sufficiently secure place of exile. New orders commanded that John be moved under heavy guard toward an unnamed settlement on the cold shores of the Black Sea. The soldiers guarding his final journey understood that the imperial court felt no particular goodwill toward their prisoner. Consequently, they paid almost no attention to John's rapidly failing health as they forced him across difficult terrain. Day after day, the guards drove him through brutal exertions, far beyond anything his frail body could reasonably endure on the road. The banished bishop soon became seriously ill and sensed that death was rapidly drawing near. John made one final request. He asked to be taken into a small church located beside the road. Inside that modest sanctuary, he peacefully received Holy Communion for the final time and said farewell to everyone gathered around him. Then the man whose eloquence had shaken emperors and moved cities delivered the briefest and perhaps greatest sermon of his life. With a weak but clear voice, John said, "In all things, glory to God. Amen." With those words, John Chrysostom, the Golden Mouth, died far from the cathedral where he had once preached with such commanding power. Only a handful of faithful companions stood beside him inside a forgotten roadside chapel at the edge of the known world. When news of John's death reached Constantinople and other imperial cities, many believed a terrible injustice had been committed against an innocent bishop. Some considered his treatment not merely unjust, but sacrilegious, because the church had helped destroy a man of extraordinary faith and courage. For years afterward, John's devoted supporters refused to recognize the legitimacy of the new bishop installed in Constantinople. They also rejected communion with those supporting him, especially the increasingly isolated patriarchs of Alexandria and Antioch. This painful division within the church continued for more than 3 decades after Chrysostom's death in exile. The schism ended only when, 31 years later, John's memory was formally restored, honored, and publicly vindicated. His remains returned to the capital amid extraordinary ceremony, celebration, and vast crowds lining the streets of Constantinople. At last, the city that had once expelled John welcomed his body as the remains of a triumphant and beloved saint. His coffin was placed inside the rebuilt Hagia Sophia, where his voice had once thundered against the powerful. It was the same cathedral where the devastating fire that helped destroy his career had once burned. Comparing Chrysostom with his contemporary Ambrose of Milan reveals an intriguing pattern of similarity and sharp contrast. Both bishops confronted imperial power directly and refused to soften the gospel's demands for the comfort of rulers. Yet Ambrose generally succeeded, compelled emperors to perform public penance, and died peacefully within his own honored city. John, by contrast, was defeated, exiled, and died almost forgotten at the distant edge of the known world. The difference may have involved not only circumstances, but temperament, political instinct, experience, and methods of leadership. From long political experience as a governor, Ambrose understood the mechanics of power and knew when to bend or stand firm. John, formed as a monk, never learned, or perhaps never desired, the subtle art of political compromise. He preached the same uncompromising message to emperors and beggars, even when his own survival depended upon restraint. In the long span of history, however, this uncompromising quality became the foundation of his enduring legacy. Across many Christian traditions, believers in both East and West remember Chrysostom among the most quoted and revered preachers in church history. Throughout the modern world, his words about wealth, poverty, possessions, and responsibility toward powerless people still challenge readers 16 centuries later. Exile and death silenced the Golden Mouth, but countless sermons, letters, and treatises preserved his voice. Across the centuries, those words continue speaking with undiminished force to every generation willing to hear them.